Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Howard. I'm one of the technical marketing engineers for the Identity Services Engine team. And we're here to talk about ISE deployment planning and strategies, which is part of our ISE Basics or Getting Back to Basics series that we are doing for ISE in 2022. So the idea here is we want to be able to have a set of beginning sessions for you all on how to get started with ISE and teach you about the fundamentals of the product. And so today I want to talk about planning and strategies. But before we do, I wanted to be able to first ask, which team do you belong to in your organization? The reason for this is because ISE kind of straddles the networking team and the security side of the house. It involves a lot of identity. We work with profiling endpoints in the IT organization, the OT organization, and maybe you're in a different part of the organization. We'd love to hear where you sit there. So I'll give you some time to answer that. And while it's happening, let's cover what we're going to talk about today. The basis of this talk is from the ISE high-level design that I wrote many years ago. And so we're going to be going and talking about some of the things in there, like objectives in your environment and taking stock of the different endpoints and PKI capabilities that you have, how you can use all this information to write some policies and potentially do integrations, play with it in your lab to validate things before you actually push it out to your live production environment to do enforcement on all these different scenarios. So that's kind of what we're going to try to do here today. And so, Rigo, before we get into this, do you have the answers from folks on which department they belong to?
Yeah, I'm looking at the answers right now, and what I see here is that the majority of participants are part of the network team. And not so far behind, we have the next group who said they are with the security team.
Yeah.
And then as well as we actually have a tie for those who said they are in the IT team as well as the OT.
All right. We've got a good mix then. Not surprising, like I said, because uh, ICE does a lot of different things, and so it can apply to all of your different roles and all these different groups or departments. So, as you can see here, there's a lot of different things that people will buy ICE to do. Some only focus maybe on solving one of these problems, but many often choose to do multiple of these different things. I'm sure you're familiar with them all, right? Doing TACACS device administration, guest portals, agentless posture for visibility on endpoints, BYOD, secure access, just all these different things ICE can do. And while it's fantastic that ICE is so powerful and can do all of these things, it also overwhelms people when they see all of these things and like, oh my gosh, where do I even begin to do this, right? Um, and that often results in us hearing this phrase a lot. I know a lot of people just say, wow, ICE is really complex. It does so much, it does so many things. How do I even begin to deploy this? And so that's really why we're here today, is because um, it can be overwhelming if you let it overwhelm you. The thing to do is to stay focused on your priorities, your top risks and security, and why you're trying to secure your network infrastructure. Don't try and do everything at once. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today to make it easier for you. So that's where we start with the high level design. I have some things in here. It's almost like a little checklist you can go through and kind of think about, why are you doing this? Why did the business decide to purchase ICE? What are the specific problems you're trying to solve? What is your existing network environment that you need to implement it on? What are the specific things that you're trying to do? What are the policy? What are the security policies you're trying to implement with ICE? All these kinds of things. How are we going to do this? So take a look at that when you're done here, and hopefully that'll work as a nice template for you. Now, why do we have to have all these questions? Well, it's really simple. No one, no customer, is the same as another. Everybody has slightly different needs, or as I like to say, everybody's the same but a little bit different. Uh, you know, Governments are trying to, keep their national security interests. Financials are trying to protect their brand trust. Healthcare, they're trying to protect their patients as well as their patient data. Schools are trying to educate their students, whether they're at home or in the classroom, and give them all the latest tools and materials they need wherever they happen to be. So everybody's got a little bit different need and priority in what they're trying to do. So whichever one of these verticals you happen to belong to, you need to recognize that just because it works for somebody else, or somebody else is doing something doesn't mean that it's the best thing for you. And so you need to take a look at those different options and figure out what are your priorities. And so to that need, let's take a look at some of these. So, as I mentioned, some of these different verticals or organizations are going to have different needs depending upon what their objectives are with their customers. So, if you're a tech company, you want to try and protect your intellectual property. So you may want to set up things around that. If you are a manufacturer, you're going to have some OT situations with um, manufacturing floors. Maybe you've got some robots and different things that you want to protect. Um, Whereas if you're, in the hospitality industry, maybe, hotels or maybe even entertainment like a big stadium or something, right? You just want to make sure that all the people can get access quick and easy. So it's all very, very different. So keep in mind what your objectives are with securing your network, what your highest priority risks are for security. What are you trying to protect? And with that in mind, what is the existing networking environment that we're working with? Are we trying to secure wired, wireless, and VPN? Are we only focused on the wireless right now? Or have we already done wireless and VPN and now we're trying to make sure our wired network is secure? And as you're going through that, I'm sure that nobody has 100% Cisco networking gear in their network. I mean, we would love that, but I doubt that's the case. Everybody seems to have a little something from, multiple vendors. And so that means that you probably have different kinds of hardware from those vendors. Maybe you've got different models. Each one of those is running different software versions, which means, some of them have different bugs than other ones. Uh, that can introduce its own variability. And ultimately, when you have different hardware and software, that means that you have different capabilities in those devices. And what you're able to do with ICE can vary based on those different enforcement mechanisms available to you in those different regions. So taking stock of all those, is it are you up to date in one particular location, but the others they still need to get refreshed, or how is that distributed? How might that impact your rollout of ICE, right? These are some things to consider. And then when it comes to scaling it, ICE we measure scale by concurrent active endpoints on the network. And so depending upon your organization, maybe you're a small organization and you're all in one place, so that's fairly easy. But maybe you're also you have a lot of different locations, and so you have a lot of people spread out in a lot of locations, and so that can impact how you choose to implement things. Uh, or if you're a large organization, how are you going to scale things out there? I just did a webinar talking about ICE deployments and scaling last month. So if you didn't catch that, I recommend you go watch that on our YouTube channel or in the ICE webinars archive. And you can learn more about how you can scale ICE and adapt it across your different geographies. Finally, the kind of management team that you have and how you operate your networking and security teams can have an impact. Is ICE and increasing your access control, is that something that's being driven from the top down, or is it something that's initiative from your own team and you're trying to work with everybody else to make that happen? what are the different dynamics within your organization for how things get done in terms of policy? Do you have different regulations you have to worry about in different countries, different regions, or maybe different departments have different rules that you have to work around? And when you need to get your job done, can you work with your colleagues in the network access team, the security team, the identity team, the endpoint desktop team? Can you do all that? Or are you going to have, some political challenges there? Along with that, we also have different tools, right? If you need to get a change pushed out on a switch so that you can test a particular network access control feature with ISE, how long is that going to take? Is it going to take a month to get it scheduled and implemented, or can you do that tomorrow night? So those are the kinds of things that we need to consider when you do this and planning out your schedule. So along those lines, now we talked about those things, I want to talk about some interesting organizational challenges that I've seen over the years. We've talked about how ISE handles authentication, authorization, and accounting requests from our network devices as endpoints come into the network, so we can authenticate them and only give them the right level of access. And we do that by authenticating them against your identity services and potentially sharing some of that authentication information with different security services to better protect you after we've admitted them to the network. So this is typically how we look at ISE, right? And as we found out, most of you are on the enterprise side or the security side, but we also have some of you from the IT and the OT organizations out there too. And I'm sure you are familiar with all this. Now, what's interesting is the enterprise side or the network team, actually doesn't cover that full thing. The endpoints are probably belonging to a separate endpoint team. Security doesn't span that whole thing necessarily. But what's interesting is ISE also works with Cisco's DNA Center, and that makes it interesting if the security team is the one that's rolling out ISE, because now if there's DNA Center has integrations with ISE, and the networking team would typically own DNA Center so that it can provision the network access devices with all their different configurations and things, right? So now the network team and the security team has to work together with ISE. I've also seen situations where if you have virtual instances of ISE, it may need to be managed by a separate compute or server team. So even though your team, network or security, you purchased it, it's actually managed by a different team, and it's just your licenses that go on their virtual machines. That can create some interesting dynamics, especially if you don't trust them to provision your virtual machines correctly, which we've seen. So we also have other groups like the Active Directory or identity management team in there. We may have that team actually being responsible for provisioning all of your endpoints, your desktops, making sure they have the right software, the right packages, the right agents, right? A lot of times that's provisioned by Active Directory group policy objects. And so if you need to get 802.1x supplicant configurations pushed to Windows workstations, you got to work through that team to make it happen. There's no way that you can do it manually, on thousands of desktops or workstations. You need to work with that team to make that happen. And if that's not a priority for them, well, that's going to delay your rollout of 802.1x in your organization. So that's something to be aware of. You also need to be able to push certificates to those endpoints so you can manage them. And so that may be a separate department, or that may be that same Active Directory team, or maybe that's managed by somebody on the security team. Other endpoints include, IP phones. That's probably a separate telecom, team. And then we've also talked about the need for the OT organization or maybe facilities. They have a bunch of different devices that need to get managed now. More and more of these things are getting added to the network. So how does that work? How are we going to manage them and get them provisioned to do 802.1x as well, or manage those endpoints? And one of the ways to help manage some of these disparate devices is with mobile device management software. That's getting really, really popular now with Azure and Intune. So instead of being provisioned from Active Directory, it's actually being provisioned from the cloud with Azure and Intune or one of many other mobile device management vendors that we have that work with ISE. So ISE can work with all these different things to make sure they're up to date and compliant and can authenticate onto the network. And speaking of cloud with something like Azure, now that everything is moving to the cloud, what else does that change for your team and the way that you have to work with them, or maybe even move ICE to the cloud, right? So all of these different choices, when you're rolling it out, can just make it really difficult for you as the ICE administrator potentially. And hopefully you have somebody at the top, a CXO type person that is helping to push these initiatives, and that's why you have ICE, and they want to make sure that the network is secure so that when you're trying to push a particular policy, you don't have to keep asking the desktop team, hey, when are you going to roll those 802.1x configurations on the workstations? This is part of a centrally managed project. It's going to get done. They're being held accountable to help you. It's not just about you. It's everybody working together. Security is not it's not a single application. It's not a silo. It's everybody working together. It's pervasive. You have to integrate it. Otherwise, the weakest link is where people are going to get through and compromise your network. So you have to have all these components working together when you roll out ICE. So just be aware of these things. I'm sure some of these things you know what I'm talking about. You've experienced these things. You know the people in your organization that may be difficult to work with, or it's going to be a challenge. So just keep those things in mind as you're rolling this out. And we touched on digital certificates a little bit with the certificate authority. And I just want to remind everybody that this is really important with ICE. ICE does so many things with digital certificates. The most basic being, basic 802.1x authentication. We want to make sure we have a secure EAP tunnel to securely send our user and device credentials into ICE for authentication. And we also have the ability to do, BYOD certificate provisioning from ICE, because ICE is actually its own certificate authority, or can be. So that's another way we can use it. And then if you want to secure your radius traffic, because radius is what is it? Gosh, it's going on like 30 years now. It's a fairly old protocol based on UDP. It's not encrypted, and so if you want to encrypt your traffic, or if you're going to send something over the internet to ICE in AWS or even internally, and you want to make sure that there are no prying eyes looking at your radius traffic, you want to make sure that you secure it inside of a radius DTLS tunnel. So that's another thing that would require a certificate. If you're going to share any information with different security applications, over PX Grid, the Cisco's platform exchange grid, that's going to require a secure tunnel. And all these things use certificates on ICE to accomplish this, including when we provision certificates to our BYOD endpoints, we can use the Secure Certificate Enrollment Protocol, or SCEP, to do that. And of course, that's going to be done securely. When you log into ICE, that's done over an HTTPS connection. If you want to do logins to different portals with SAML, right? When we talk with the different SAML identity providers, that's going to be done securely with HTTPS. And same thing with when your users connect to web authentication portals, that's going to be done over HTTPS to protect their credentials there too. So all of these things require digital certificates in ICE. So I mention this because please take the time to provision ICE with a publicly signed certificate. Either you have an in-house enterprise certificate authority that will sign it, and it has been signed by a public CA, or maybe you need to go have your ICE certificate signed directly by a public certificate authority. That's up to you how you want to do it, but just get it done. We've even our webinar back in December that our TME Hosuk did, he showed how to do certificate signing with Let's Encrypt for free. So you can even have Let's Encrypt sign your certificates. So I'd encourage you to go back and look at his webinar to see how he was running an Acme script to do certificate signing with Let's Encrypt. So lots of different options for you. And if this is something that you're really interested in, you want to know more about it, our TME Pavan, who's actually part of our Q&A panel tonight, he is going to be talking about digital certificates for you next month, as you heard. So I invite you to sign up for that webinar and join Pavan to talk as he talks about it, and you'll learn more about exactly how all this works in ISE. So as I said earlier, security is really important, and it requires all these different components to really work together. Another aspect of it is that there's a spectrum of security from not much security, but it's really easy, all the way down to it's really secure, but it's really hard. And so where you want to fall on that spectrum is up to you. And so if we take a look at this from a network access perspective, the way we typically do this is based on identity. And so identity is something that involves what we call authentication factors, which is typically something that you know or possess or is part of your being. Something like biometrics in that case, right? And depending upon the number of factors, will increase the strength of that authentication. And so if we plot out some of the different ways of doing this, you can see kind of where these different things fall. So obviously, the easiest of all is to have no security, just have open networks, right? And that's how it used to be, um, 20, 30 years ago. But that's not the world we live in now. We must secure things now. We can't have open networks, or we can for our guests, right? We can have hotspot networks, but that's a limited scenario, and we control everything else. A lot of people use, WPA or pre-shared key methods in order to get devices on the network. A lot of times we have to use MAC authentication bypass. How you implement that can make it really, really easy, or it can take a lot more work depending upon how you want to do it, how strict you want to be. And when you get into something, and so all these, by the way, I consider these to be zero, I could say zero-ish. They're basically zero factors. And the reason for that is because when you're talking about MAB, the MAC address can be spoofed. It's not really a unique identity. And when you talk about WPA or the PSK methods, that's a pre-shared key, which any number of endpoints or users could know. And so that just identifies them as a group. It doesn't individually identify them. The one caveat to that, obviously, is IPSK, the individual pre-shared key. So that theoretically would identify only one device, but it's just identifying it by MAC address, and that could be spoofed. So that's why I kind of put it on the line there of zero-ish and single factor, depending upon how you want to think about it. But as we move into single factor, um, you know, doing something like IEEE 802.1x with the password is really sort of the industry standard of, how we judge things. Uh, and so some customers want to do certificates on top of 802.1x because they don't want their users having to use passwords, or they don't want the potential for a man-in-the-middle attack to take that password and reuse it for something else. So they like provisioning certificates. So those are your single factors. And then as we move into the far right side, where it starts to get much stronger but more difficult, is 802.1x machine plus user authentication. So now what we're doing is something that we call EAP chaining or EAP chaining. And we're taking both a user credential and a machine credential, submitting those at the same time, and ISE is authenticating those together. And then there's also the ability to do 802.1x with MFA or multi-factor authentication. I'm sure you guys are all doing some form of multi-factor authentication today, but not a lot of people are doing it with 802.1x. And the reason for that is because it's a terrible user experience. If you have to sit there and you have to put in your tokens constantly, every time you disconnect and reconnect your mobile device, what a horrible experience that is, right? And so not a lot of people are doing that. And then the last one is a security key. I love my security key. as long as I have it plugged in right in front of me in my computer and it's right there, really easy to access. But if I am downstairs in my house or I'm all cozied up in bed with my iPad and then I want to go to a site and I need a security key to log into it, how annoying is that? I have to get up out of bed. I got to go walk over. Where's my laptop? Where's my security key? I got to unplug it, plug it into my tablet, and then if you ever lose a security key, wow, that's just the worst. That's a lot of work to go have to re-enroll your keys in all these different sites and things. So it can be, terribly inconvenient there. So I've also not seen. I know these security keys have the ability to have certificates on them, and you could potentially use them for authentication. I've not really seen it. If you are doing it, I would love to know. Please reach out to me. You can email me, thomas@cisco.com, or reach out to me on WebEx or something. I would love to know how you're doing it, what your experience is, and kind of learn from you and how that's working for you. So those are your different options when looking at identity-based authentication with 802.1x and MAB and different things. So to do this, you usually need an agent. It's called a supplicant. That's the fancy word for an agent for 802.1x. So AnyConnect obviously is our VPN software, but it also has something called the Network Access Manager or NAM module built into it. And that is an 802.1x supplicant. You don't necessarily need it. There are some times when the Windows native supplicant, it has a few scenarios where it's not the best. And so you may want to look at using the Cisco AnyConnect NAM module for those things. I'm not going to go into all that today. I'm hoping to have a separate webinar in a few months where we talk about the Windows supplicant in great detail, as well as other supplicants. But I do want to talk about the native supplicants here today, starting with Windows because it's the most predominant one. It's interesting, the Windows supplicant, actually, there's two supplicants on Windows workstations, if you didn't know that. There is a wireless supplicant, which is enabled by default, and that's why when you open up a brand new laptop from the store, it just magically can connect to your Wi-Fi when you enter your password very easily. But if you want to do it on a wired network, you must manually start the wired supplicant service in Windows. And likewise, if you have your employee laptops, you probably don't want them messing with that, or they're just not technically capable of doing all that stuff. You need to provision it for them. And so that's why you need to consider using Active Directory group policy objects, or you need to use, something like Azure and Intune or another mobile device management product to provision those networking profiles for your SSIDs, your certificates, your supplicant settings, all those different things. So if you're not doing that, you really need to invest or look in how you're going to be pushing those things out, like I said, with either Active Directory policy objects or a mobile device management type service. When it comes to Apple, a lot of educational schools, universities use Apple devices. And for that, they have something called the Apple Configurator. By default, Apple just does, basic PEEP type configuration, which is done with the username, password, or pre-shared key, something like that. But if you really want to do any of the other EAP-based protocols, you need to use the Apple Configurator, or you need to use one of the MDM products I talked about to create these profiles that can then be provisioned to the computer to do these different protocols. You cannot do it in the GUI without this profile provisioning process. So you need to have that if you want to provision your Apple devices that way. And that's both Mac OS as well as iOS or iPad OS devices. Finally, you have Android, and Android, it's built by geeks for geeks, so you get all the options in the Android supplicant stuff you probably don't know about, don't care about, but they're all in there for you, depending upon what you want to use. And so that can be Might be difficult for some users to understand what their options are, what they need to configure. So again, using a mobile device management type application can be really helpful to provision their mobile devices for them for your network. And then of course we've got speaking of geeks for geeks, deploying it with Linux, we have the WPA supplicant. That's available for you. You got to go in and configure a text file with your SSIDs and things like that. If anybody has done this at scale, I would love to hear your experience on how you provisioned all of your Linux workstations with WPA supplicant, or if you just left it to your employees to figure out on their own. So again, reach out to me, and I'd love to hear how you did that. But otherwise, the capabilities are there, but you got to go configure it on your own. So that's why I keep talking about mobile device management, or maybe some of you have heard it called enterprise uh, mobility management, and before that BYOD. It's all kind of the same thing where we're trying to provision these devices, whether they're our employees' personal devices or maybe they're our corporate assets, but we need to manage them in order to make sure that they have, uh, first of all, the credentials, maybe a certificate or something to authenticate to our networks if you want to go down that path, or just to make sure that they're properly protected with a PIN code, and they have the apps that you want your employees to have on their devices, or any information that's downloaded goes into a secure encrypted container. So these are all the kinds of things that a mobile device management application can do for you, as well as provisioning certificates and things like that. So this is really helpful to have one of these. And like I said, if you don't want to do MDM, you could use AnyConnect to do some of these things. We have the ability to do posture with AnyConnect, and we also have the ability to push certificates with ISE as part of our BYOD enrollment process. But honestly, I would recommend using an MDM product, because if you're already concerned about security and you're going to be pushing certificates, you're really going to want to make sure that you have all the other compliance checks in place with a proper MDM policy. So you may as well go ahead and do that. So we have a lot of different MDM partners that we work with as part of our Cisco Security Technology Alliance program. All the vendors that you see there, of course, Cisco Meraki has the Meraki SM Systems Manager, which is our MDM if you want to try that. I actually did a webinar about ISE and Meraki a few months ago, and I showed how I was able to use the Meraki SM to push a profile to my iPad in order to then authenticate to a network. So if you're curious how that works, go look in our ISE webinar archives, or go to our ISE YouTube channel, and you can see, if you search on ISE with Meraki, you'll see how I did that. So then after we cover those major devices, right, we have everything else. And this is a very, very long tail of different types of endpoints that you need to configure. And the reality is that while many of these devices can be configured for 802.1x, like IP phones, printers, cameras, things like that, some things cannot. And the reality, a lot of times, there are things like, your manufacturing devices that just were never meant to have a user interface, or, do network authentication, and that's fine. You'll handle those typically with profiling. You'll deal with those things. Or medical devices, same thing with medical devices. Profiling is probably the best way to go about uh, understanding what the device is, and then authorizing it onto the network based on that profile. But when you have phones and cameras and things like that, that they typically are capable of 802.1x. The real issue here is that it's not a priority. Um, I have, a little $300 HP printer. It has 802.1x. I have cameras I've had, surveillance cameras in my home for like over 10 years. And, they're like $100, and they all do 802.1x. So a lot of times the capability is there. We just don't take the time to configure it because it's not important to us. or it's not a high priority, right? And you're going to encounter this as soon as you try to authenticate an IP phone to the network. You're going to talk to the unified communications person, the IP telephony person, and say, "Hey, can you go, push certificates to all the phones?" And they're going to say, "Oh, sorry, I got other things I'm doing. It's really not important to me." They don't care about you and your authentication project, right? With ICE, they don't care. They got other things they're trying to do, and so um, that's really the reality of it. Or they just don't know how. They're like 802 what? I don't know what that is. And so that's where the gap is. It's not the devices aren't capable. It's just that we don't configure them to do it for any number of reasons. So with that, you just have to go in expecting that that's going to be the case, and you either need to push really hard to get them to authenticate if that's important to you, or come up with another plan like Mac authentication bypass, profiling, things like that to figure out how you're going to authenticate these devices, um, so that you know what they are and how you should be segmenting them in your network. So we talked a little bit about having agents, uh, including AnyConnect. And AnyConnect is what we use for doing posture and determining what's inside of a computer. So ICE can do profiling using different networking protocols to figure out what's on the outside. But if you want to know what's inside, like what's the firewall settings, what applications are they running, do they have a USB dongle connected to it, all these kinds of things. For that kind of stuff, you need to have posture or compliance checking going on that device. And you can either do it with AnyConnect and the AnyConnect posture module, or we now have the ability in ISE 3.0 and later to do agentless posture, where we can remotely log into a device and we can basically do an inventory that way. So we have these options for you, and this is a great way to get visibility so that you now know not only who my user is, what the device is from something like profiling, but now you can get inside and understand what are my users running? What are they doing? Are there things that I don't want them to be doing? Or why are they disabling the firewall? Or all these kinds of things. And now you can do compliance checking and determine if you need to start getting more strict and start enforcing that compliance policy with ICE. So that's something else that you can do. Like I said, this works very similarly with mobile device management products as well. So whichever one you think is going to work for you, I encourage you to use it. But you can do it, without having to buy any MDM or um, having to install agents by using ICE and doing it agentlessly to get visibility to start. So with that, I want to have one more question for you all. What is the first access control scenario that you are planning to use with ICE? You know, there's some that people typically start off with, maybe VPN, corporate wireless, guest wireless, or maybe you've already had wireless set up for a while. Now you want to start doing wired stuff. So what is it for you all, right? We'd love to hear how you're planning to use ICE. So while you guys are putting that in, people almost always start with wireless. The reason is because you have to. You must secure your wireless network, right? And so it's a natural pairing with ICE to just do ICE and wireless. Um, Within there, you've got different scenarios like guest and BYOD and corporate access, maybe IoT access for some of your devices there as well. So those are all obvious use cases to get started with, because you don't have those physical barriers or boundaries or protections like you do with a wired network. So then once you've got that under control, a lot of people look at doing the wired network. And because we have this long history of having open wired networks, that can create some challenges, because if you try to go out and just start doing authentication and enforcement on every single switch port, that's going to cause problems, because there's a lot of devices out there that maybe you have an inventory, you don't know what it is. If you start to block it from the network, you're going to get yelled at, right? So you have to do some homework. You have to get visibility on what's out there, how it should be authorized, maybe who owns it, what should the policy be, all these kinds of things. You got to do your homework on those. And so that's where doing things like profiling can help out and figuring out what the policy should be. And probably what kinds of devices should be on your network, like I said, from what type of vertical you are. Um, and once you know what those devices are, maybe you want to look at doing some posture on those things to see, are there any applications or things I should be concerned about that people are running on them? And how are we going to enforce compliance on these things? And once you know all this information, you go, wow, I really need to start making sure that, my surveillance cameras can't be talking to my printers, and those can't be talking to my IP phones, and those can't be talking to my users. You want to keep all those things segmented. So, doing something like scalable group tags for software defined segmentation is a good way to do that. And of course, once ICE authenticates it to the network, we don't care what the traffic is. That's for another security application to go figure out. And so, being able to do what's called RTC, or rapid threat containment, if something is detected, like a vulnerability, or somebody is exhibiting malicious behavior on the network, we have the ability to detect that from another security application and have it call into ICE and kick that user or device off the network. So that's a fantastic use case because, again, the longer those malicious users or devices are on the network, the more damage they can do. So if we can automate that, that really helps minimize the damage. So that's a great scenario to handle as well. So, whether you start, on the left-hand side and you jump over to the right-hand side, that's up to you. But typically, this is kind of the progression that we see. But Rigo, why don't you tell us what people said in the poll?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So after reviewing all of the answers, I see that the majority are planning to go with the corporate wireless scenario.
Yeah.
And in close second, we have a good number of participants going with guest wireless and then as well as wire segmentation.
Yep. There it is. Right. All those things, very typical, not surprising at all. And so, like I said, everybody's got their different priorities, and so those are all perfectly fine places to start. Um, so hopefully this is going to help you know how to prioritize and things you should be looking out for. And that was really the goal of today's talk. So as we get into starting to do some of the enforcement of your policies, one of the things that becomes very important is your environment, your network devices. And I always like to stress that ICE is a radius and TACACS AAA server, or authentication, authorization, and accounting. So as long as your network devices support radius or TACACS, they can talk to ICE. ICE can support it. So uh, if you ever wonder, does ICE support my device? Does it do radius? Does it do TACACS? Then yes, ICE supports it. It's that simple. Now, usually when people ask that question, what they're really asking is, well, does my device have all the capabilities to do all the cool stuff with ICE, like URL redirection and posture and TrustSec and things like that? That's really what people want to know. And that's a device capability. That's totally independent of ICE. That's something you need to look at um, your vendor, right? If it's not Cisco, find out, what does this thing do? It does radius, it does TACACS, fantastic. But can it do layer 3 access control lists? Can it do, fully qualified domain or DNS access control lists? Uh, can it do URL redirection? Those are the kinds of things that really start to differentiate switches, especially. We've had the ability to do DNS based ACLs and wireless controllers over a decade now. That was a critical thing back when we first started doing BYOD in the early 2010s with all of our, iPhones and tablets and things. So switches finally just got that capability. I want to say it's like 16 to iOS XE 16.9 or something. We just got the FQDN access control list capability in our switches. So that's a really cool thing. But sometimes you have some devices that, if you look down here, you can see, you know, our lower end switches can't do trust sec, or whoops, maybe these devices, we have a little exclamation mark there. And what that means is that it's probably missing the ability to do URL redirection or some kind of an access control list. It's more of a layer 2 switch, not a layer 3 switch. So those are the kinds of things you have to watch out for. Do your homework on those specific devices. But remember, Radius or TACACS, it works with ISE. Now it's just a matter of what can the hardware and software on those devices do. So speaking of the software, over the years, we've done a lot of things to improve how 802.1x works on the Cisco switches. So back in the old days, straight IEEE 802.1x worked by authenticating a single host at a time. If you tried to use a hub and plug in a second device and the switch detected a second MAC on that switch port, it would perform a port shutdown. It would just totally take it offline until you manually reset it. So that's how standard 802.1x works. So even today, if you had a machine with VMware and bridged mode or something, as soon as you fired up that VM and the switch detected that second port, it would shut that port down. So that's what we called closed mode security or single host mode security on those switch ports. But sometimes it's nice to have multiple devices hanging off of a single switch port, right? Maybe you've got somebody sitting in a cubicle, they only have one network drop, but they've got to have multiple computers to do their job to develop something. So maybe that's a nice thing. But keep in mind that you're limited because you got one VLAN for everybody to ride on. And then it's a matter of, well, whose VLAN is it? Is it the first person that decides the VLAN, or is it the last person in that decides the VLAN? So now you can have two different endpoints fighting over what the VLAN should be on a single switch port. That's not very nice. So then we have something that we came up with called multi-domain mode, where you can put the IP phone into a voice VLAN, and then you put the data device, the workstation, into a data VLAN. But still, that's only good for one data device, not two data devices. So what was the next logical thing to do? Well, let's support everything. So now we have a voice VLAN, we have a data VLAN, and we can do multiple MACs in a single data VLAN. The problem with that is, maybe you want to have different restrictions on endpoint 1 versus endpoint 2 in the same data VLAN. So can you do that using access control lists? Does your switch support access control lists? Or can you even do a scalable group tag assignment and perform the software-defined segmentation right there at that port? And that's really cool because you can even do it on east and west traffic on that port with multi-auth mode with a switch that does TrustSec if it supports enforcement. That's a really cool thing. So if you want to know more about these host modes, take a look at our ISE Wired Prescriptive Deployment Guide. If you just search for that, you'll find it on our community page, and it talks about how to deploy best practice configurations with 802.1x on switches and ISE. And then when you do the enforcement, VLANs is probably the first thing people think about when you say segmentation on a network device. We can totally do dynamic VLAN assignment. That's how it's been done ever since the beginning of 802.1x. The problem is people want to assign a default VLAN, and then maybe a device gets a IP address so they can profile it, and they go, oh, you're a printer. I want to switch your VLAN now over to the printer VLAN. And when they do that, they change the VLAN, but the device is stuck with an old IP address on the old VLAN that will not work on the current VLAN. That causes problems. So we have ways around that in ISE to, basically when we do a change of authorization, we can do a hard switch port link down, basically a link down, link up to basically send a physical signal to the endpoint that you lost connection. You need to get a new IP address, right? Not the most elegant solution, but that's the only thing that ISE can do to control it. Other things you can do, which we think are a little more elegant, especially if you have layer 3 switches, is go ahead and put everybody in a default VLAN. I'd have that single data VLAN like we were just talking about, and now use access control lists to limit what they can or cannot connect to. So once they connect, they just have one IP address on one data VLAN, and you can have multiple devices on that VLAN, don't care. And now the ACL will control what they can reach. That's really cool, especially now with the DNS based ACLs. And then, of course, the ultimate really for us is scalable group tags and software defined segmentation, where now we can tag all of your packets flowing out of an endpoint into the network and apply policy and segment what they can get to that way. And we can even do east-west based segmentation right there on the same switch port per MAC address, or on a uh, wireless SSID as well. So I did mention that we have a lot of different security partners that we work with to work with ISE. I mentioned MDM partners. We have a lot of different, vulnerability vendors, profiling vendors, different things that we can work with. So if any of these logos look familiar to you, since I know we have some security folks here, we can integrate those products with ISE to have better security, more integrated security to, again, speed up time to detection and improve the security across the network, make it integrated, make things work better together to improve your security. So this is maybe something that you want to look at integrating with ISE once you get started. So we've talked about some strategies. Now it's time to get into actual policies, how we do that. And when I think about policies, I like to think about the who, what, when, where, why, and how. You've probably heard of that. It comes from this poem by Rudyard Kipling, where he's talking about not only investigative journalism, but his own little daughter who asks him a million questions a day about things. So it's kind of cute the way it came up. But this is where it first got started, and this is how we use it in network access control. So obviously we want to know who or what is connecting, and maybe there's some other conditions like where they're coming from or when they're coming in that we want to allow access or not, and how should we provide that access? Is it in a VLAN, an access control list, scalable group tag, all the above, right? How are we going to control all that? So with that in mind, I encourage people to think about going into the lab and understanding what are all the different ways that users and endpoints are going to come into the network. What are the different methods they're going to use? What are the devices they are going to use? What are the credentials they are going to use? And if it's successful, how are you going to authorize them? And if it's unsuccessful, how are you going to help them? Are you just going to let them sit there with no access? Are you going to redirect them to a WebAuth page? What's going to go on there? So try to figure those kinds of things out because that's going to help you write your policies and figure out what the authorization profiles are going to be once you understand all these different attributes, the who, what, when, where, why. And then you can figure out the how much as part of this exercise as well. So that when you actually get to writing your ISE policy set, right, we've got these different, the rule names, the conditions, the profiles, or the results. We can actually start to use one or more policy sets to implement those. And so here's some examples for you where we can go through and have different policy sets for different types of authentications. So you see we have, starting at the top, monitor mode. So maybe we're just starting to deploy a wired authentication in a particular authentication in a specific location. So we're going to mark those network devices as being in monitor mode, meaning we're going to let everything let everything go through. We're not going to enforce anything. We're not going to restrict anything. We just want to see what happens if we subject it to policies. We're always going to let everything in, just like we always have. But now we're going to start to understand what's possible and what rules we can enforce. If you have a guest SSID, go ahead and match on that and then use that to apply all of your guest policies. And that may be separate from your other wireless policies for your corporate, your IoT devices, or maybe maybe you have a mixed deployment of Cisco Catalyst wireless, and maybe you've also got some Meraki wireless for different branches or home offices or something like that. If those have different policies, you can say, well, I don't want to waste time going through my corporate wireless policies for my Meraki wireless in my users' homes. So I'm going to have separate policy set for that, right? So we can go through all these different things, and even Mac off bypass we can do for IoT devices. And inside of there, we'll have our rules for um, different MAC addresses, endpoint profiles, all those kinds of things. So lots of different ways we can use policy sets to filter out all those scenarios we played with in our lab. And then when it comes time to actually writing the policy set, if you look at the rule name, that's really telling us why should we give this thing network access? What is it doing? Um, why is it a valid scenario? Or maybe it's an invalid scenario and we need to block access, right? Why are we doing this? And then to understand that, we need to know, well, who is it? What is it? Are there rules about when it's allowed and where it is allowed from? And then once we put all those conditions together, we can assign that authorization profile for how much access it should get. And the idea here is going back to, zero trust and the principle of least privilege, so that we only want to give a user or device enough access for their job or their role, right? We don't want to give them, if we give them too much access, that's how we get malware spreading through our company, because you give them a little opening and they'll take it and run. Just only give it the minimal amount to minimize the attack surface, right? And once you have these things, you can actually implement a policy. So you can see, look at all the different rules and the reasons why these different users and devices should have access. And then we have the corresponding conditions for the when, the who, the what, and the where, for how they're coming in, or what the device types are that are legitimate and what groups they belong to, or what groups the users belong to. And then based on all those things, what is the access we will provide to them? Or maybe we deny the access, right? There's several denies in there as well. So these are some examples I wanted to provide you for how some things could be done. By no means is this a complete list, but I think it's a good sample of how things can be done. So when you play in your lab, we have free evaluation licenses with every ISE installation on virtual machines or appliances, or even in AWS if you want to play with ISE and AWS. So you get 100 endpoint licenses all the way through the premier level, so you can play with posture, you can play with profiling, you can do all the advanced stuff, PX grid, you have all that. You even have a device admin license if you want to try TACACS. So all that you can play with in your lab, separate from your production unit. And when you go to do enforcement, I already mentioned this concept of doing monitoring. And so I wanted to mention it here. We talk more about this in the ISE Wired Prescriptive Deployment Guide. That's where this came from. So if you want to know more about this, I encourage you to read through that. But the idea here is, when you first start to do a wired deployment, you want to monitor things. You don't want to just go in and go from, free and open access to totally locked down and closed. If you do that, you will make your users angry and you will have a problem. You need to be more gradual. You need to make sure you understand, do all the endpoints connecting? Can they do 802.1x? Can I put them in the right authorization? And that's what you monitor to make sure that all the supplicants are configured properly. When that endpoint team push the group policy objects, it's all working like it's supposed to. There's going to be a few, misconfigurations somewhere. It's never perfect, but are you at like 90+%, or are things just, you have a ways to go still? And if you see things are working properly, now you can move on to something like the low impact, and you can start pushing ACLs or VLANs and things like that and seeing how that works. And then the close mode is really for customers that have absolutely high security standards. This is your governments and your financials. They have extremely high security needs, and so they will go with the close mode option almost every time. Keep in mind that close mode, while more secure, also incurs a higher support cost, because if anything goes wrong, they don't get access, and now they got to call the support desk, or You got to have a way to fix that computer so that the supplicant works properly. And if you don't have an MDM, how are you going to do that, right? So keep these things in mind, and that's why I encouraged you to try this out in the lab and see how this would potentially work if you did these things. Uh, so one other thing I wanted to mention is when you are playing with this in the lab, you have the option actually to change some of these settings. So you can actually enable or disable rules, and you can even create authorization rules where you monitor them. So you can create a new one in monitor mode. It will uh, it will show you a hit in the far right side there. It will tell you how many times there was a match, but because it's only in monitor mode, it won't implement it. It won't act on it. It will keep going down the list to the next one, but you'll at least see that, yeah, if you wanted to make a small change to a policy, that you have the ability to test it out first and then actually deploy it and enable it, or just, you know what, I'm not going to use this anymore. I'm going to quickly disable it. That wasn't working for me. So you have options there in your policies. Another thing is how you deploy. So some customers will choose to deploy everything in a single location. So they'll start with one location and they'll do all the different scenarios, and then they'll take what they learned and they'll roll it over to the next location and the next location. So um, that's not typically what I see, but if that's how you want to roll it out, that may be what you want to do. Typically, what we end up seeing is something more like this, where you start with a single scenario and then you roll that out across all of your locations, and then you keep adding to those things. And the reality is actually a little bit of a combination of both. And the reason is because, if you think about it, first, you might start doing things like visibility and profiling, um, because you want to know what's out there, what are the devices, what are my users, so that I know what policies I need to enforce, and then I can start to secure them. And I need to do guest or BYOD scenarios. What's interesting is, like I said, depending upon your network environment, you may not have the capabilities in your hardware in every location. And so you may want to do it in a certain location, but you need to upgrade that hardware. And you're going to have to wait, you know, 3 months, 6 months, a year before the budget becomes available, until there's the time, or they have other projects going on. They don't have time to upgrade it. They don't have time to push the config changes on the switches, right? And so you may need to be more flexible and do things in different cities, different locations. And so that's more realistic. That's typically what we see. And so, be flexible, think about these things as you're planning your deployment, and just be aware that, again, there's no one way to do this, but it all goes down back to what are your priorities based on your security risks, and what are the things you need to protect. Prioritize those and implement from there. So with that, I want to remind everybody that we have a fantastic community where you can ask questions. We have phenomenal partners and customers that answer the questions here, as well as the ISE TMEs. We're looking out in there. We're answering questions there too. So I remind you to take a look at how to ask the community for help, because if you're going to ask a question, please help us help you by giving us the details about your deployment. What ISE version are you using? What are you trying to do? If there's an error, what's the error? Don't just say it doesn't work. Do you know why it wouldn't work? That's not enough information. That's not what you would tell TACACS. So don't leave out that information for us. Please help us help you, and provide good details, and we'll do our best to give you an answer. And with that, I want to leave you all with these resources for some of the things we've talked about today.